Morning people, welcome back to F Politics. Today, Sky News and BBC News allowed the Reform Party's Nigel Farage and Richard Tice to get away with blatant racism, a disregard for the safety of children, and the destruction of the UK economy. For starters, the BBC's Laura Koonsberg and Sky News' Trevor Phillips, they accepted the right-wing premise around the whole discussion around grooming gangs.
Grooming gang scandal. Dreadful abuse of young girls by groups of men of mainly Pakistani origin that the authorities did little about, sometimes ignored, before investigations and some inquiries in recent years.
Or quoting Tories like Robert Jenrick, but without actually challenging those narratives.
This scandal had started with our importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures.
See, if you listen to that, you would think that the problem of group child sexual exploitation was mainly among Asian men, which is the narrative that people like Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are always trying to push.
Look, tragically, there has been a massive cover-up of a horrific grooming gang scandal by people mainly of Pakistani heritage, some of whom may be British-born, many of whom may have come to the UK.
But grooming gangs isn't a mainly Asian men problem. The Home Office has officially confirmed that it is most commonly white men. In fact, when you look more broadly at convictions for sexual offences against children, Asian men make up 3.6% of all convictions, whereas white people make up 71%. But the narrative that people like Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are trying to push is that the main sexual threat to children is Asian men, and that the left don't want to talk about it because it doesn't suit our agenda.
The British establishment, senior politicians, and may I say, the mainstream media have turned the other way. And there has been this sort of, this doesn't suit us because we want mass immigration, we want diversity, and this is inconvenient, so we won't explore it.
But if grooming gangs are most commonly white men, and 71% of all sexual offences against children are committed by white people, but you only mention child sexual exploitation when the perpetrator is a brown person, then you are ignoring the vast majority of child sexual exploitation because it doesn't suit your agenda. Like, Nigel Farage even broadens this issue out.
They call it the grooming gang scandal, but it's not, it's the mass rape scandal.
And we do have a massive rape scandal in the UK, mainly the fact that less than 1% of all rapes lead to a conviction. But people like Nigel Farage and Richard Tice only talk about these issues when they can use them to attack brown and black people, thus proving that they do not care about the actual victims in these cases, they only care about using them as weapons for racism. And even though there have been several inquiries with recommendations to make sure that we never have what happened in Rotherham ever again, Nigel Farage says,
No big, full national public inquiry.
The existing reports already have recommendations for councils to reach out to places with vulnerable children to make sure they're protected. So has Nigel Farage not read those reports, or does he just not care? And when it came to the issue of race, the Rotherham report blamed the fact that when complaints were made about Asian men hurting children, they weren't listened to because of a misplaced sense of political correctness. That literally means white people not understanding how to not be racist and thinking it means turning a blind eye when complaints are made about brown people. So the report is explicitly saying that those children were failed because of the belief that anti-racism is the same as turning a blind eye to the crimes of ethnic minorities. And yet the right is now saying that anti-racism means turning a blind eye to the crimes of ethnic minorities. People like Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are pushing the exact same misunderstanding that led to those children being abused. And Richard Tice even tries to turn the race issue around.
I think we definitely do have two-tier justice. I'm afraid we've seen it in 2024 on multiple occasions.
But Richard Tice based his two-tier justice thing on how the Manchester airport suspects, you know, the ones where the police officer stamped on the guy's head, how they weren't being charged, but they have been charged now. So that argument has been proven false.
I think we've seen a form of racism. If white men had sexually abused children of a different skin colour in northern towns, there would have been absolute outrage amongst the mainstream media and the political class. But instead, because it was Pakistani men against white British children, there was no such outrage.
Really? Because this has been all over the news for the past week, but it came out last year that police in the UK are 6 times more likely to strip search black children. Yet for the mainstream media, that story was over in a day. And that's despite horrific stories like what happened with Child Q, the 15-year-old girl who was stripped naked because of a false accusation of having weed on her. But Nigel Farage brings in other topics as well.
They're also angry economically. We are getting poorer. You know, if you look at the last 8 quarters, GDP per capita is falling in 6 of them.
Once more, Nigel Farage only exists on our TV screens because of Brexit. He was the head of UKIP, the UK Independence Party, whose sole function was getting us out of the EU. He then ran the Brexit Party, whose sole function was getting us out of the EU because that was its goddamn name. The Brexit Party then changed its name to the Reform Party, a party who I have on camera admitting that Brexit is making us poorer, and Nigel Farage is sat there as the head of the Reform Party complaining about how we're getting poorer, and the BBC's Laura Kuenssberg just doesn't mention the role that he played in that. It would be like inviting Chris Brown on your show and letting him complain about the normalization of domestic violence. In fact, it's very much like that, because the topic that Nigel Farage was just complaining about was the safety of women and girls, yet Nigel Farage hired an MP that was convicted of beating up his girlfriend. So for Laura Kuenssberg, a veteran journalist of the BBC, to not mention Brexit when Nigel Farage is complaining about us getting poorer can only be a deliberate effort to help him become Prime Minister. But of course Farage blames immigration for us getting poorer.
Mass immigration not only makes it tough for young people to get a house, not only makes it very difficult to see a GP, not only makes our roads and infrastructure struggle to cope, it's making us poorer.
The problem with that is all the experts say that our economy desperately needs immigration because of our aging population. And when we were in the EU, we had a system called the EU Free Movement of Workers, so people could come here to work. But leaving the EU got rid of that system, and the government's economists say that since Brexit, immigration has been less beneficial to our economy. So the job of managing immigration to make sure that it makes people here richer, not poorer, that has been damaged by the Brexit that Nigel Farage supported. And he tries to distance himself from the Tories by saying they're allied with Labour.
The anger isn't directed at the Labour or Conservative parties. I think people increasingly regard them as a uni party.
Only this was Nigel Farage a couple of days ago at a private Conservative event laughing about being racist. And when Donald Trump came up, it got kind of sinister because you start to see how Nigel Farage is simply acting as a foreign agent for Donald Trump. Because he points out that Donald Trump is a potential danger to the UK unless we do what he wants.
And so, yes, he of course is talking about tariffs, which is one example of something that could happen that could really hurt us. It's all avoidable. It's all avoidable. You know...
If?
Well, I think we have to think, I think Starmer has to think about 2 things very hard. Firstly, does he want us to be tied ever closer to a failing Europe, or tied to a booming America?
But because we are literally in Europe, we do 47% of our trade with the EU, whereas we only do 17.6% of our trade with America. So it is objectively, mathematically against British interests to sacrifice our trade with the EU in the name of improving trade with America. And it gets even worse.
And secondly, I think the one thing Keir Starmer needs to really think about is this. We're the biggest foreign investor in America. They're the biggest foreign investor here. Trade is important. Our cultural ties are deeper today than they ever have been at any point in history.
By speaking on behalf of Donald Trump, he's speaking on behalf of somebody who he knows has the explicit aim of making the NHS pay more for drugs so that Americans pay less. And when he talks about foreign investment, that includes allowing American companies to buy up parts of the NHS, which has been promoted by several other Brexiteers. And given that the American healthcare system is going so well that people cheer when health bosses are shot in the street, I don't think this would work out well for the NHS. So Nigel Farage isn't just willing to damage our economy for Donald Trump, he's willing to cost thousands of British lives. I'm Femi, make sure you follow F Politics so politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.